strategy program here at our institution. I want to say a special greetings to our friends at C-SPAN who are watching today, and also a greeting to those people who are watching live streaming on the Washington Note and the New America Foundation's website. I hope you'll join us very often. We love the streaming aspect because while we have a full house here, there are people all over the world actually watching with us right now. I'm with Jane Mayer, and I'm extremely pleased to be able to have a conversation with Jane this morning about her new book. I just checked a few minutes ago, and her book is number 12 on Amazon right now. And hopefully after today's program, and we do have Politics and Prose here with us, you can all pick up your own copy of the book, and I think Jane's got a few minutes to help sign some of them. We'll get those numbers up even further. But Jane Mayer, who we all know as a Washington correspondent for the New Yorker magazine, one of the bright stars for many years at the Wall Street Journal, the author of 2 books, Strange Justice, and also Landslide, The Unmaking of the President, 1984-1988. But what I really love about Jane Mayer was she wrote a pivotal key article that I don't think New America had anything to do with the article other than the fact that we convened some cool dinners, which the New York Times has written about, called salon dinners. And every once in a while, some of the folks that Jane would cultivate, so to speak, were at these dinners. And she wrote a great piece that I think was the first significant article, and I'll use the word exposed, but told the story of David Addington. David Addington is now Vice President Cheney's chief of staff. And this article in the New Yorker, which ran in July 2006, was called "The Hidden Power, the Legal Mind Behind the White House's War on Terror." And while I don't want to speak for Jane, in many ways I see this great book, The Dark Side, the inside story of how the War on Terror turned into a war on American ideals, the book version that added so much more to this great article in the New Yorker. So I'm going to have a conversation with Jane, ask her some questions for 20-25 minutes, and then we'll open up to questions to all of you. And we'll have people from the New America Foundation staff move the microphones around. But Jane, I'm going to begin with the very last line of the book.
Oh, great. Okay.
And it's a cool line. I don't know how you got him to say it. Philip Zelikow, who was counselor to Secretary of State Rice, wrote it as in his words, as he put it, "Fear and anxiety were exploited by zealots and fools." And with that line, that fascinating line from one of the Bush administration's chief players in these fears, this is an internal critique. Can you help set the stage for this book? Tell us who the primary actors were and what you were trying to do.
Sure, but I'll thank you very much. First, I want to say I'm really happy to be here, and it's incredible to see so many people interested in this. Thank you so much for coming. And as far as how this book came about, Steve's being very modest, because when that profile of David Addington came out in the New Yorker, he said, "You know, I think there's more to this. This might be a book." So, so the idea was planted right here. At any rate, that line from Philip Zelikow, who is a historian down at the University of Virginia. He's Condoleezza Rice's, he was her counselor when she was at the State Department, and he was also the executive director of the 9/11 Commission. So incredible sort of Republican credentials and academic credentials. When I was interviewing him, and I said at one point, "How do you think this will be seen in history? The descent of the United States into state-sponsored torture?" And he paused for a minute, and he said, "I think it will be seen as a blot like FDR's internment of the Japanese during World War II." And he said, "And I think that it happened for much the same reason in much the same way." And the quote, I thought it was staggering, was, as you just read, "Fear and anxiety were exploited by zealots and fools." A really tough thing for somebody inside this administration to say, I think, and a very truthful thing. What I tried to lay out in this book was, in the very beginning, the first chapters are about that fear and anxiety. They are about the panic that set in right after 9/11, which I think everybody can understand, certainly anybody who was in Washington or New York. I was in Washington that day, and it was incredibly upsetting, obviously. And for the people who were running our government, they felt this awesome and terrible responsibility to try to keep the country safe. And you really, it's hard to fault them for that. And in fact, and I don't fault them for that. But what we didn't see as they were trying to portray themselves as calm and not, there were stories about how, I think people might remember the president was resolute, and Cheney didn't break a sweat during the sort of the bunker hours of when they were trying to figure out what was going on. Soon after, in the weeks right after that, there was a lot of panic inside the White House. There were a number of false alarms taking place inside there. They had installed very sensitive sensors for bioweapons and chemical and radiological weapons. And on one day, on October 18th, 2001, one of the alarms went off in the Situation Room, and Cheney, I am told, thought that he might have been lethally infected. So you have to imagine, what would it be?
Dick Cheney himself thought he had been.
I am told by two sources that Dick Cheney thought that he might be facing the end. And he contacted the NSC and very calmly explained that everybody who'd been there in that vicinity might have been infected, which included himself.
If I can interrupt just for a second, let me just read a section on Cheney's paranoia. In quotes from Jane Mayer's book, a sense of constant danger followed Cheney everywhere. When he commuted to his White House office from his vice presidential residence, he was chauffeured in an armored motorcade that varied in its routes to foil possible attackers. On the back seat behind Cheney rested a duffel bag stocked with a gas mask and a biochemical survival suit. Rarely did he travel without a medical doctor in tow, which I can understand, but this is a guy,
He's been facing down death for a very long time. And he actually, before 9/11, it was interesting, and there have been a number of wonderful accounts of this, but he practiced for doomsday for years. I mean, and they did these extensive rehearsals for what might have been a nuclear attack during the Cold War. So he would go under the, bedrock to a sort of a continuity in government exercise for a number of weeks. So when we were hit on 9/11, he'd been thinking about catastrophic attacks on America for a long time. And then when they had the false alarms in the White House, and even one where he felt he might have been infected himself, which turned out, of course, not to be true, you have to imagine the fear level. And one other thing I think that I hope maybe public policy people will think about in the future that really ramped up the fear inside the Bush White House was that after 9/11, the president and vice president started getting raw intelligence, which people in the intelligence world understand. It was something called the Matrix report they were getting. And before 9/11, the president would get briefings from the CIA, but they were briefings that had been analyzed at great length to figure out whether or not there was something reliable and worth worrying about. After 9/11, Cheney, who had long been suspicious of the CIA's abilities, said he wanted to see everything because they had missed this. And so they started getting bombarded every morning, and this is still true. The president and vice president begin their day looking at reams of stuff that
Explain raw intelligence to give. This is unfiltered, unprocessed, unweighted.
Completely, for the most part, unreliable and described by Roger Cressy, who was at the NSC for some of this period, as pure garbage. I mean, they get things
so they start out their days with scary garbage.
Really scary garbage. and I quote a couple people in the book. There's James Comey, who was the #2 in the Justice Department for a while, described the effect of getting this stuff every morning as being like locked in a room with Led Zeppelin. He said it could have an effect on anyone, and so their judgment is being highly tested, put it that way. And so it's in this environment of panic that they hatched a new system of law, one in which they began to think of the checks and balances that were created by the Founding Fathers to make sure that people didn't overstep in terms of one branch taking all the power. They felt that those were impediments, and that they really needed to be able to be unstopped in going to whatever means were necessary to reach their end, which was protecting America. And so this is where the lawyers come in. Cheney is obviously not a lawyer. Bush is not a lawyer. But they turned to a handful of lawyers who reinterpreted the laws pretty much to come up with a system that allowed them to pursue terrorism around the world in any way they wanted to do it. And this book is about the consequences of that. And in a way, we really, in this country, were forewarned. Cheney, I think it was the Sunday after 9/11, went on NBC and told, I think it was Tim Russert, from now on, we're going to have to work on the dark side, the title of the book. Kind of in the shadows, he said. What I tried to figure out in this book is, so what did that really entail? And it's sort of hair-raising, really, what it entailed. I mean, it was, they came to embrace a lot of very extreme measures, which I think now, and I argue in this book, might have been seen as quick fixes that have come back to have just terrible long-term consequences 7 years later.
Let me read this segment from Dick Cheney on Tim Russert's show on September 11th. It says, "We'll have to work out sort of the dark side, if you will. We've got to spend time in the shadows in the intelligence world. A lot of what needs to be done here will have to be done quietly, without any discussion, using sources and methods that are available to our intelligence agency if we're going to be successful. That's the world these folks operate in, and so it's going to be vital for us to use any means at our disposal, basically, to achieve our objectives." So that was the tone on 9/11/01 that you've captured so well. Just, I know this is on screen, but just a quick, before Jane Mayer's piece, or even before today, how many of you actually knew the name David Addington? Just put up a quick hand. So this is an informed crowd. I bet if we went out on the street in DuPont Circle, it would not be there. I mean, one of the really interesting things about your profile of David Addington before in this book is of all the players in this, he's the least known. He's not written about. David Ignatius wrote a great headline on him, one in a short article, calling him Cheney's Cheney. It's a term I liked a lot. Mm-hmm. But in your profile of Addington in the New Yorker in 2006, you tell him of Addington carrying a copy of the Constitution around in his pocket, but it's annotated in his views of the powers of succession.
Yes.
So again, I mean, this is really bizarre. So the element that concerned him about the and also there's just a great vignette in the opener of this piece that I'll remind people of, about Colin Powell at a football game hearing about, for the first time, and I should mention General Powell's former chief of staff is with us, Larry Wilkerson. But this is a great vignette where Powell hears for the first time about the warrantless wiretaps. And he says, "It's Addington," he said. He doesn't care about the Constitution. But nonetheless, David does carry the Constitution around with him. Can you share with us a little insight into this?
Okay. I mean, the thing that, you know, and does he care about the Constitution? This is going to be important in coming weeks and months, because there's kind of a growing drumbeat now about whether or not to treat some of these people and some of their decisions as war criminals or criminal acts. And
by whom?
By some members of Congress, by human rights groups, some of the legal activist groups. There's a sort of a kind of burbling up going on. I would say, and that from the reporting I've done, that David Addington believes in a different interpretation of the Constitution. It's his own understanding of it. These people don't see themselves as criminals. And I actually had a very interesting conversation with Arthur Schlesinger, the late historian, before he died, about this. And we were talking about Bush versus Nixon. And his point of view was that Bush was by far the more dangerous president, he thought, because of some of the decisions he'd made had such terrible consequences. And in particular, he cited torture as possibly the putting the United States in the worst light in its history. But he said of Nixon, that Nixon, he thought, had a criminal mentality, and he did not think that was true of Bush. And I think that Bush and the people around him were very convinced of the righteousness of what they were doing, which is why I come back to that quote from Philip Zelikow, because it's playing off of Louis Brandeis's quote about zealots. They were zealots. I don't think that they were criminals, at least not in their own mind, and that's for sure. So
one wonders whether Arthur Schlesinger's ghost was channeling through Frank Rich in his column this last weekend, because he makes really the similar point that this is like the Nixon days, but the Bush team is worse. But one of the questions, you profile so many of these players, you know, Zelikow, Eddington, John Bellinger, the young guy, Matthew Waxman, and others who are some heroes and some villains, Gonzalez and others. But where is George Bush in this story?
it's funny. I had the same problem that Jack Goldsmith had when he wrote his book. People may remember it. He was the head of the Office of Legal Counsel in the Bush administration for a while, for about 9 months. And he wrote about the same subject matter to some extent. Bush keeps sliding out of the frame of the picture. Maybe future historians will find that he truly was controlling everything and that we just don't know. I mean, there's a lot we still don't know. But in the reporting that I was doing, all of the fingerprints on all of the national security policy went to the Vice President's office. And Bush famously calls himself the decider, but the question is, what was he given to decide about? It seems that one of the most interesting things about David Addington was he figured out in Washington and in the White House in particular, paper flow is everything. And he was the last box that paperwork went into before it went to the president.
But
so
how did that get structured?
Isn't that something?
Yeah, I mean, that is amazing.
It
this
is
is
amazing.
The Vice President's
the lawyer.
office, the lawyer of the Vice President. The Vice President, as Ben Franklin said, is not supposed to be that big a deal.
Right.
I don't know what the quote is, but it's out there.
And
but this Vice President has, you know, one of the things was interesting. There was a discussion in a debate a few years ago about the power of the presidency to decide to declassify something because they'd been leaking documents, challenging other people who've been leaking documents, but they themselves said they could leak. And so I went to look at the declassification statutes and executive orders. And in it, the Office of Vice President, as an institution, in amended executive orders, was written in 11 times by mention, where the previous executive order had mentioned the OVP's office once. And again, one of the things I think for those people who are doing PhDs on presidential power ought to one day look at is the degree to which the legal structure of the Office of Vice President within that system has changed dramatically. So,
well, I mean, part of it is that I mean, we were talking about the character of David Addington. He's a lawyer, but he has protean energy, I think. I mean, you have to give him some due for some things. He terrifically smart, just never gives in. This is somebody who has worn everybody else out in the White House who's come up against him. He's described as a bully. He's described as rude. He's described as, you know, just unpleasant frequently. There's some scenes of meetings that take place in the White House here where other people are described as having nervous breakdowns in front of him. But he just doesn't stop. And he and Cheney had been working together for a really long time, I mean decades, and both they and of course Rumsfeld too, because of their experience in Washington, figured out the bureaucracy, and they understood what paperwork they needed, what committees they needed to be on. They were masters also at killing things they didn't like by sending them out to be studied. And so there's a, for instance, is the effort to close Guantanamo. There are descriptions of a group of people who tried inside this White House again and again to fix what was happening in Guantanamo. And they would find themselves off in meeting rooms where whatever decisions they took had absolutely no, you know, effect on anything. They were gumming it to death, they used to say. And so anyway, he's a bureaucratic master.
So you're saying that inside the Bush administration there were some folks trying to do the right thing, saying, hey, wait, the Geneva Conventions matter.
Well, that was one of the great surprises.
What happened to them? Were they shipped off, jailed, silenced?
None have been waterboarded, as far as I know. But they
as far as you know, rendered anywhere, black sites.
Rendered out of Washington by themselves. Yes, that has happened. It was considered a scary thing to go up against the Vice President's office. In fact, there's a scene in this book in which two very powerful people, the head of the Office of Legal Counsel, Jack Goldsmith, and James Comey, the #2 person in the Justice Department, feel that they have to speak in codes because they think they might be being wiretapped or that somebody might be following them. They might be in physical danger. And they sort of laughed about it to their friends later. I talked to a number of their friends about this. And
they thought Addington was after them?
They thought that they were at this point trying to withdraw the torture memos, and they knew that the Vice President's office was deeply attached to those memos. They were the part of the legal structure on which the whole program, the program of interrogation and detention, rested. And they felt really, truly imperiled in some way for taking on the Vice President. But as I was going to say, this book is filled with stories of people who, both inside the administration and outside the administration, tried to see if they couldn't convince the Bush White House to win the war on terror in an honorable way that did not include torturing people. And and they were defeated at every turn.
There was one National Security Council lawyer who happens to be Condoleezza Rice's lawyer today at the State Department, John Bellinger. And there's a segment in the book here that says, Bellinger was in a political minority in the White House, however. His concern for international law and world opinion was ridiculed by the hardline lawyers of the so-called War Council. Addington particularly disdained Bellinger, according to several sources who watched their constant skirmishes. Addington was a sectarian purist, instinctively challenging and excluding anyone less extreme, and Bellinger epitomized the art of compromise that Addington deplored. Bellinger had discovered it was always 5-1, with himself outnumbered by Addington, Gonzalez, Yu, Haynes, and whichever lawyer was sent by the CIA in the revolving door. Nonetheless, he thought that if they were making mistakes in Guantanamo, potentially incarcerating the wrong people, it couldn't be ignored. Can you talk a little bit about the Bellinger-Addington battles and this so-called War Council?
Sure. John Bellinger, who is still the top lawyer at the State Department, actually became so frustrated at one point, and one of the pieces of news in this book is he threatened to resign at some point because things had just become so impossible inside the White House. But you know,
did the threat matter?
Yes, it actually worked. It was when the Supreme Court decided on the Hamden case that the Geneva Conventions did extend to the detainees, which was a very scary moment for many people in the White House, because if the Geneva Conventions apply to the detainees, then breaching the Geneva Conventions are war crimes. And a number of people suddenly thought, uh-oh, you know, what have we been doing and what are we facing next? And so there was a movement led by people in the Vice President's office and the Justice Department to overturn the Supreme Court, which was a really radical idea, don't need to tell you. And what they wanted to do was try to quickly get legislation that would simply put through a law saying the Geneva Conventions do not apply to detainees. And it was you know, clearly a coup of sorts that was being proposed to overturn the highest court in America. And at that point, Bellinger said, absolutely not. This is a terrible idea. And he went to Rice, and he, it seems, also talked to Karen Hughes, and Rice and Hughes went to the president, and they said, don't do it. And at that point, Bellinger said, and I will resign if you do this. And somehow that trio talked the president out of doing it. And it was one of the few, actually, instances I can find where Bush disagreed with Cheney.
Interesting. Let me read another account from your book, and this is about, I want to talk about the people who were the subjects of, we'll call them harsh interrogation techniques, which is the lingo that one might, you know, superimpose torture into, but harsh interrogation techniques. Kahatani was also forced to strip naked, wear a leash, and perform dog tricks. He was forced to wear a bra. He was deprived of the opportunity to use a toilet after having been force-fed liquids intravenously. By day 4, he'd become so dehydrated that a Navy corpsman administering an IV was unable to locate a vein in his arm, causing a doctor to be called to implant a shunt in his hand. I mean, the people what's interesting about this book is you get into the real people, into the real stories. You tell this important story about the Red Cross, which I know from years ago you were really working that story hard. We talked a few times about it.
Call Steve and say, do you know anybody who's seen it?
Who will go on record of those folks. But at the same time, the Red Cross was saying this is torture. And can you talk a little bit about the individuals who were aware of the Red Cross finding and why this, until your book, to my knowledge, has really not been out there?
Well, I think it's, you know, I mean, it's very important news. The Red Cross has credibility unlike any other organization when they say something's torture. This is, they're independent, they're not political, they're experts on the treatment of prisoners of war, and they were the only outside organization that had access to the CIA's detainees. That's what this particular finding was about. The 14 who had been transferred from the black site prisons to Guantanamo, the Red Cross went in and had the opportunity to talk to these people at some length and got their stories. And so what I've tried to do is reconstruct in the book the allegations made by the CIA's prisoners. And you know, what they describe is fairly harrowing, really. It's hard to know for sure whether it's credible, but apparently the Red Cross found it credible enough to say, we conclude that it's not even a close call. The United States' program constitutes torture. And as such, the top people in the administration are in jeopardy of being prosecuted for war crimes. Now, you know,
You write Cofer Black, the former head of the Black Ops Unit, actually thinks he will be he
talks about
dragooned.
Cofer Black's the head of the terrorist section of the CIA, and right after they've set up this program with these extreme measures, he says, you know, one of these days, you know, we're all going to get prosecuted for this. I have to say, Cofer says that he doesn't remember saying that. Tyler Drumheller, to whom he spoke, certainly remembers it. I just asked him about it again last night, and he says, oh yeah, Cofer always says he didn't say it, but he always says it. So who knows? But there was a sense, I mean, and one of the things I wanted also to get across in this book is there was a sense, and it became more and more of a crescendo, that a lot of people got very uneasy and began to fear that there might be criminal ramifications for some of these things. And you know, as everybody knows, the videotapes of the waterboarding sessions, 2 of the waterboarding sessions of the CIA, were destroyed. And I'm told that on those tapes was one source says evidence. I mean, it was really upsetting stuff. So upsetting that another source said that whatever else it would have done if it was ever released, the reaction would have been, he said, unmanageable. Meaning, if you think about what the photographs of Abu Ghraib did to America and the reaction around the world, what would waterboarding, being seen live with people, Muslims tied down to you know, the waterboard look like? It was bad, I think. So.
You know, let me one question before. I want to get to the audience question, but one of the questions that's posed by this question of are many people in our government war criminals, and this is particularly on my blog a constant topic. Have you thought through the legal process by which accountability can be affixed to a David Addington, a John Yoo?
First of all, I want to say I'm not a lawyer,
right.
And so and I just rely on interviewing a lot of lawyers, and but what I am is a political reporter. I've covered the White House since the Reagan era, and off and on, and so I really see this much more as a political question than a legal question. And I think you have to ask yourself, do you see the appetite in this country for putting people on trial for who could say that they were trying to protect America in a very difficult time? I think it's a real stretch to think that the public's going to demand that these people go on trial. So, as a reporter, my interest is mostly in trying to get, at the very least, the records. I want to see, there are tons of mysteries that are still unsolved. There are a number of legal memos nobody's seen. We've never seen the list of all the interrogation techniques that have been approved by this country. There are plenty of cases where people have disappeared. There's some where people seem to have been killed. We really don't know everything yet, and I would like to see at some point the books open and maybe hearings of some sort so that we can at least learn what the country's been doing and think about which part is worth it and which part's not. But I don't know about trials. What do you think? Actually, since you're the questioner, I'm going to just put it to you because you follow Washington more closely than most people. What do you think?
I think that the town is going to struggle with this for decades. I don't think it's going to be a quick fix. I think there are too many people in the we'll call it the Democratic camp or the opposition camp who found themselves complicit at some levels with the decision making that went on around this. That they were advised and informed of classified goings on, and thus they knew.
Right.
And that knowledge somehow preempts their activities. I was very, very interested in your quote some time ago about Addington from Jane Harmon, who know this, and I think that she is one of the interesting people who had a more strident view on these, but I think that she's had sort of a moment of conscience on a lot of this stuff and sort of walking back. But she's an example of many others within the Congress who had some complicity of knowledge, at least, of some of what was going on.
and I think it's going to be hard. I'd love to give a fresher answer to people that, but I think it would be dishonest that you're going to have, vigorous and rigorous hearings. You've got in the House Judiciary Committee today.
Just today,
you have Douglas Feith right now and Philippe Sands, a British barrister, who are having it out. Lawrence Wilkerson was in one of these hearings some time ago. Douglas Feith decided not to show up on the day that Colonel Wilkerson was there. John Ashcroft, who surprisingly turns out to be an interesting sort of hero in this at some parts on wireless wiretaps and others, will be testifying next week. But that brings me to Gonzalez, Alberto Gonzalez, who comes out as a pretty pathetic little worm.
I'm still worried about libel. I don't know about you, so I don't know if I accept that. So.
I'm just telling you, I'm not saying he is a pathetic little worm, but just that he seems to come out that way.
You know what? Can I say one of the things that really interested me about the dynamics, the social dynamics in the White House, was that Gonzalez, who goes from being the top White House lawyer to then the top lawyer in the United States of America, is too scared of Cheney to stand up for things that he privately says he thinks are, need to be stood up to.
Did you interview him?
No, he did not. They declined to be interviewed, as did David Addington, for that matter, and so did Vice President Cheney. It's a funny aside.
I think I've spent more time with Cheney than you.
It's a funny aside. I did ask to have an interview with him about a year ago, saying I'll be writing over the next year. Is there some time? And I got back an answer saying he's got a very busy schedule. So I guess I wasn't a high priority.
Gonzalez apparently was opposed to the torture policies and torture program, but was too scared of the...
There's an anecdote in here that comes from about a conversation he had with the number 2 in the Justice Department, James Comey, who Comey comes across as quite a hero in this, as he was in the NSA story too. Comey says, I think this is wrong. I think this is not, America's better than this. We really should not be torturing people. And Gonzalez says, oh, I agree with you. And I've been trying to stop it. And Comey says, well, great. There's going to be a meeting. I'm going to prep you and get you all set for it. And so let me give you some arguments. And they get all revved up to go to the meeting. But actually what happens at the meeting, at least according to other people there, is that Gonzalez never speaks up at all. And Gonzalez also says at one point that he disagrees with David Addington on something, but he, quote, couldn't afford to take it on. He doesn't want to fight on these things. So you really see that obscure office of the vice president, the described as not worth more than a warm bucket of spit by some earlier occupants, really ruled in this organization. Handful of people really had the power in this country for a while.
Interesting. Let me go to all of you now to pose questions or post counter views, and I'm going to ask you to ask the one of the 2 questions you may have, and or 3. Only one. I'll cut you off if you go over, and please identify yourself. Let's start right here.
Will Amatruda Catholic University. With regard to the issue of possible criminal law remedies for what's been going on, if Gerald Ford could pardon Nixon before he ever got indicted, what's to stop Bush on January 19th from
Good question.
Pardoning everybody whose name he can think of?
Absolutely. There's absolutely nothing to stop him. And in fact, a writer named Stuart Taylor in Newsweek this week actually argues that that's what should be done. He says there should be sort of preemptive pardons for everybody. So that is going to be one argument, and we've seen other people pardoned in the administration.
Stuart Taylor is saying there should be?
He said he's arguing that there should be because he's saying they didn't have criminal intent. Now again, I am not a lawyer, but historically I don't know that that's washed when it came to things like Nuremberg. But I have mixed feelings about this myself, and I haven't really sorted it all out because I am a reporter more than an advocate. But I can say that there's, and I think it could be a very poisonous and ugly thing in some ways. But on the other hand, I can tell you from the reporting I've done that the fear of being prosecuted had a very useful deterrent effect at some points in this administration. There were people in the CIA who said, I'm not getting into this one because we know where this comes out. We've seen this movie before, and we're going to wind up,
I don't want to talk about where we've seen it, but that sort of logic applied could imagine a lot of other states that have done horrific things where the players may not have had criminal intent.
Well, yeah, it's true, but I mean, so when you have no accountability, and there really has been no accountability for any of this at this point, really, except for, you know, a couple dozen people on the bottom of the military system who've been sanctioned for what they did at Abu Ghraib, but when there's no accountability, there's kind of then a green light. But when you put people who've been trying to keep the country safe on trial, it's a pretty heavy sledgehammer. So I don't really know how it's going to come out.
Interesting. Gary Mitchell?
Thanks. And Jane, thanks especially for marvelous work. Gary Mitchell from the Mitchell Report. A quick question, which will sound like a legal question, but not intended to be. Ben Wittes, formerly of the Washington Post and now at Brookings, has just written a book about the law and the long war, in which he argues that that the current legal instruments in this country are insufficient to deal with the complexity of the legality of
the kind of combat that
Right.
we're having.
Right.
Right.
And in particular, there's the question of, do we use criminal law, or are we really in a war, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
My question is not to ask you to opine about that, but in your conversations with people, did you get from them the sense that there was this conflict about whether the law was sufficient to deal with this,
Great.
and the other
Yeah,
piece of this is
definitely.
that as he said, you know, as flawed as the Bush administration has been, so too for Congress for not having acted. So I'm just curious.
Stepped up to
Great.
this.
What conversations you had.
It's a conversation that I think would be really beneficial to be taking place in the presidential campaign, because this is a big question. What are you going to do with terrorist suspects? And you know, the great rationale that was put forward for why we went to this new legal system was to preempt crimes before they were committed. And you know, that of course flies in the face of everything that our justice system is based on, which is you have to be guilty before you're locked up, and you have given a chance to speak up for yourself and a fair trial. So I did interview a lot of people about this. I have to say, I haven't read Ben Wittes' book yet. I've heard a lot of good things about it, but I am not at all convinced of the argument. From the people that I've interviewed, it seemed to me that the FBI and others, the criminal justice system did a pretty good job before 9/11. They put away a number of al-Qaeda suspects, and they got a number of informants who they've got in witness protection programs now, who became the sources of almost everything that the U.S. learned about al-Qaeda before 9/11 came through that system. And they put people away for life terms in Florence, Colorado, and compare that to what kind of results we've gotten from this so-called new paradigm. Not a single one of these suspects has gone through a trial. Because of the way they've been brutalized, it may be that some of the ones that are presumed to be the worst terrorists, KSM, Al-Qahtani, who you talked about, who was supposed to be the 20th hijacker, they may never be able to be on trial. Nobody's been able to they haven't even charged Abu Zubaydah. They had to drop the charges against Al-Qahtani because of the kind of torture he had been through. This isn't working, what we've been doing. And I hope that people understand that 7 years later, you can begin to see that there's been terrible collateral damage from doing this. And you know, the question is, was the criminal justice system in the United States, when we treated terrorists as criminals, is that why we got hit on 9/11? Was that the weakness that caused this attack? And that's not really what the record shows from my reporting. What caused that attack, and I go into this in the book, was incompetence, bureaucratic incompetence, basically, both at the CIA, the FBI, and kind of a lack of political will at the top of the White House. They didn't have their eye on the ball. They didn't really push it. They kept meeting and meeting and made no decisions.
Before we go to Peter Kornblum here in the middle, let me mention that, particularly with the online viewers, that if you Google YouTube, the names Lawrence Wilkerson, Damien Corsetti, and Jack Clunan, I interview them in a screening. They were all involved with a movie called Taxi to the Dark Side, which won the Oscar, similar name of the book. But in it, there's a very eerie discussion between Corsetti, who was a guard at Bagram prison and brought under charges for torture and harassment and whatnot, and got through them his whole detachment. They were sort of blamed for these issues. And then Cloonan, who was basically talking about the ineffectiveness of these techniques. It's a very important thing to look at. It's received a lot of attention on
I mean,
YouTube.
Clunan says, just to say one thing, I interviewed him in the book. He's a very interesting guy, a longtime FBI agent who's out now, but he was involved in counterterrorism. He actually said 9/11 was preventable. It was just a few people who didn't do their jobs. So,
Right.
point of view.
Peter Kornblue.
Peter Kornblue from the National Security Archive. Again, great pleasure to be here. We are such a fan of your work over
Thank
all
you.
these years. I just wanted to comment that on the issue of accountability, it's more the issue of international accountability rather than whether this country is going to step forward and prosecute these officials. That may take years or may never happen, but certainly in the international community, just like with Augusto Pinochet, there will be this issue will come up. And coincidentally, it's the 10th anniversary coming up this October of Pinochet's detention in London, something I would assume was on the minds of some of these officials that you interviewed. And Chile presents an interesting parallel here because, of course, everything that Pinochet did was in the name of anti-terrorism, counterterrorism. Subversion became terrorism. And one of the things that Chile did after Pinochet stepped down from power is, of course, had a truth commission, and you've just now said we need an investigation here. And my question really is, you basically have now been the person who's pioneered a lot of the work that a truth commission would use in the United States. Tell us a little bit more about what is out there that hasn't been gotten or what you have gotten in terms of documentary evidence that would go into a formal evaluation. Other countries
Nick
have called it.
Kristof of the New York Times also recently called for this sort of truth commission. Jane?
Well, I mean, that being as a reporter, I joke that I have subpoena envy, and all I can do is beg to try to get things, and most documents I don't get, and so what somebody with access to the full record could see, among other things that I think is really important and interesting in this is, are the claims right and correct that the Bush administration has made that we had to use these methods? Did we have to brutalize and torture people to get the intelligence, and did it save lives? That's been their argument. It's been very hard for anyone to know if it's correct because we haven't seen the transcripts of the interrogations. We haven't seen how those cases rolled out afterwards. There's a lot of skepticism about it among people outside of the Bush administration. Within the FBI, people don't buy it. John Rockefeller, the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, has said he's seen no evidence of that. But I think that a group of people who were empowered to truly take a look at that record would be really interesting because it's been the greatest rationale for the program.
Zeus Yamianis?
Hi, I'm Zeus Yamianis. I'm a fellow at a policy foundation. I was very curious about what appears to be an apparent contradiction between, and maybe even a pathological one, between Cheney's own personal safety and paranoia and his complete lack of paranoia for what appears to be the American public. You know, you mentioned the matrix that he had where he's developing all these scenarios, and yet a month before that attack, they had a memo that said Osama bin Laden determined to attack in the U.S. It mentions two cities, New York, Washington. It mentions planes, and it mentions buildings blowing up. And they did nothing. That's not the actions of a paranoid person. So I'm wondering, is there some force that's stronger than this paranoia, especially when it comes to the American public, opportunism, ideology, Clinton contempt? What's your view on that?
Well, I mean, I think there was, in that particular instance, an ideological disconnect. Cheney had been spending the previous decades focused on the threat from the Soviet Union. He had a Cold War mentality. He had a mentality that suggested that it was going to be great armies and great powers that really threatened America. And it took a kind of a wild leap of imagination to think that a bearded imam living in, a mud hut somewhere was really, truly the threat that a few people thought it was. Dick Clark, who was at the NSC at the time, was one of the few people who was saying, this is no joke, this is a first-tier threat. But it didn't get their attention. It was not really sort of the mindset that Cheney had. And I guess one of the questions I have that I hope historians tackle is, how much of what happened afterwards was kind of almost guilt for, expiating, overreacting for having missed this thing coming at them? Because Cheney in particular was the person who was put on the ticket to be the wise man about national security. Bush, you remember, this was not his area of expertise. So, how much guilt did Cheney feel that this didn't happen? That they didn't stop this? I don't know, but they certainly went to extremes after 9/11 that would never, ever have even been able to be contemplated before 9/11.
Yes. Jody? Alan? We need to get the microphone to you, Jody.
To follow up on that, Jane, if they were feeling this guilt and so were determined to expiate it by catching bin Laden, why then did they almost immediately begin planning to invade Iraq, which they must have known had nothing at all to do with it? And in Frank Rich's column, in which he, based on your book, he mentions, for example, and this goes to your point about how good is information you get under torture. I bet this guy who was turned over to the Egyptians to torture comes out and tells all this false stuff about Iraq, which they choose to believe. I mean, people who choose to believe a source called Curveball have kind of made up their mind ahead of time. I mean, it just seems like an odd way to expiate guilt, to make the United States more vulnerable by opening up gratuitously a second front while letting the real perpetrator, as we now know, go free and become a menace again.
Well, I mean, first of all, I don't think they thought that it was going to wind up letting bin Laden and Zawahiri go free. I mean, I think that they misunderstood how difficult it was going to be to get them. But what happens right after 9/11 is they're enormously empowered because the world's sympathies flowed our way. And there was absolutely no opposition in Congress. Everybody was American, as was it the French or the British said on that day. There was just so. I think it's really a story of what happens when you have absolute power. I mean, and it shows the brilliance and wisdom of the founding fathers. When there were no checks, people run away with it.
Well, it's just not that it was not only that there were no checks. I think one of the things that's both dark but also a sign of Addington's brilliance was it was an opportunity to vastly expand the powers of the presidency. In fact, the war council, or the so-called war paradigm that they tilted into consciously right after 9/11 was to basically inform all branches of the executive office, that they would not any longer find themselves subject to congressional oversight, that it was basically knocking back and rolling back and to frankly being disdainful of the system of checks and balances. I mean, this is what I think is so important. I think what was embedded in Frank Rich's, wonderful review of your book was that imperial presidency. I mean, even be much further beyond the Nixonian version of this was by design in reaction to 9/11.
But the thread through all of this is that because they were so empowered, the world opinion, public opinion was completely with them, and there was no opposition. They could enact their longed-for wish lists: a war in Iraq, completely expanding the executive. Jane Harman's quoted talking in this book about how they wanted to basically reinstitute the Nixon presidency and bring the president to the zenith of power that was called the imperial presidency at that point. They could do what they wanted to do. The CIA had long had this list that was called the Blue Sky Memo, that was if you just had absolute blue skies and could do anything you wanted to do, what would you want to do? They took it out of a safe and they enacted it, and it included waging a global war on terror where you could basically track and kill people the assassination ban was, for all intents and purposes, lifted, which was a Watergate reform. So they ran with it. They had the power and they ran with it, and that's what happened.
Diane Perlman, and then we'll move it back.
Thank you. I'm Diane Perlman, psychologist for social responsibility, and my colleagues have been extremely active in challenging APA and also working, collaborating with military interrogators on sophisticated rapport building techniques which are far more reliable and effective in getting information out. So one thing is that the moral argument sort of doesn't challenge the assumption of whether these techniques are effective, which are not. So is there anyone in the administration who's aware of more effective methods of getting information, and I mean, they're all sort of gripped by the ticking time bomb theory, which doesn't really make any sense if you.
Well, I mean, the administration itself helped fund inducing information. I guess you know about this report. I'm not sure who funded it exactly, but it was anyway a report that was put together by experts who were advising the intelligence community to try to look into this. What other ways are there to get information, and does torture work, basically? And excuse me. The experts gathered from many fields came to the conclusion that actually torture doesn't work. Surprise, you know. I mean, of course, you know, looking at history and the history of the Inquisition, I think you shouldn't have had to go back to do this all over again.
But there is a popular pop culture. I mean,
There
I
is.
referred on my blog to this movie. I sort of liked it, but I didn't like, you know, this Saving Tess. You know, the movie about the sort of spouse of the widow of a former president, and who's the actor in it? Who's the Secret Service agent? Nicolas Cage.
Yeah.
None of you. These are pop cultural illiterate
think I
people
may
here.
have even
But
seen
Nicolas
it, yeah.
Cage shoots the toe off of the bad guy, and he tells them everything.
Right,
And there was
well-
great applause in the theater.
Well, I mean, and Jack Bauer. I mean, and
yeah.
I wrote a piece about the influence of 24. Little
I
did
haven't seen that show yet.
You haven't seen 24?
I'm culturally illiterate.
Talk about
I read books.
Well, anyway, the secret is it's completely addictive. So when you do get into it, you're going to hate yourself for it. But but at any rate, I thought when I was writing about it that it was just metaphorically important in terms of affecting American point of view on this issue. It turns out it was literally important. In Philippe Sands' book, he interviews somebody down in Guantanamo who says, "Oh yeah, we weren't really sure how to interrogate people. We were all watching 24, and we looked at what Jack Bauer was doing and said, let's try that." So I mean, they literally got ideas from Hollywood.
Philippe Sands' book, by the way, is The Torture Team.
The Torture Team, it is, yeah. And I interviewed the man who created 24, and I can tell you he's not an expert in the military or in law enforcement. He's a Hollywood guy who's actually very good social friends with a lot of people in the Bush White House.
This gentleman here in the yellow shirt. Thanks, Andrew.
Len Rubenstein with Physicians for Human Rights. First of all, Jane, thanks for your reporting over many years, not just for this book. One of the things that comes out is the corruption of institutions that go beyond even the Justice Department, corruption of military institutions, of medical institutions. That was the kind of fallout of what this administration did. Could you talk about that aspect of it?
Well, I am really, I mean, this is your area. You're such an expert in this area, but I am very interested in, and I have to say I was particularly appalled by the bits and pieces that I saw of the role that doctors played in conjunction with torture. Doctors and psychologists and psychiatrists. When you interview some of the detainees, or you look at the stories they've given their lawyers, and they may not all be accurate, but they certainly describe over and over again doctors appearing kind of at key moments. And for instance, Katani, you read the part about the bags of liquid that he was given and the shunts that were put in so that they could get a vein. And when he collapsed, which he did at one point, they took him to a hospital to make sure he wasn't going to die. They sort of fixed him up to make sure he was okay to go back for more of the same treatment. And it's not, I discovered from reading books like Darius Rejali's book, which is this encyclopedic book on torture in democracy. It's not unusual. Doctors actually have often played a role close to torture because detainees confide in doctors, and doctors know sort of where the limits are, how far you can push someone without killing them. And it is, but ever since World War II, obviously, there have been so many codes about ethics and science that it really shocked me. And one of the things you asked, what would you want to know? What do we not know? I'd like to know who the physicians are who appear in these scenes, and who the psychiatrists and psychologists are, and who licensed them, and whether or not they should keep their licenses after this.
That should be a congressional committee investigation. This gentleman right here. And then Harlan Ullman in the back. And we'll go back here.
Excuse me, I'm Burton Gerber, Georgetown University, former CIA operations officer. I find this all very fascinating. I have great admiration for your work earlier in New Yorker and now with this. But I do want to raise one question that you made here and that I have different views on, and that is, does torture work? The problem is that torture sometimes does work, and that's why I believe it must be opposed, first of all, on moral reasons, and that's generally what I write and speak about. Then, of course, to the efficacy of it, because often it doesn't work. But to just say it doesn't work it leaves us off from the moral issue.
I agree, no, actually with you. And in this book, I say torture does sometimes work. What I mean is that in the larger context, I think that this program has not worked. I think that
you're absolutely right on that.
Sometimes you get information out of coercion. If you never did, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation, because nobody would try it, right? If it really was completely useless, nobody would have gone there. But the problem is there are all kinds of collateral damage that comes from it. You get false information sometimes. You can't tell if it's false at the time. Thus, the story about Ibn Sheikh al-Libi, who helped lead us into the war in Iraq. You corrupt the people who are doing the interrogating using these methods.
Right. It corrupts the torturer and the society that will tolerate it.
Right.
And this is why it, first of all, must be opposed. But if you look at the edited volume, Torture, edited by Sanford Levinson, you'll find that even people who are strongly opposed to torture will then sometimes say, in certain instances, it must be done. And that's kind of scary.
Thank you. Harlan Ullman in the back. In the very back.
Jane, I'm Harlan Ullman. I want to ask you a question in a historical perspective, realizing you're a reporter, not a historian. But we've been there before. Jefferson, Lincoln, Wilson, FDR, Kennedy and Johnson, the Civil War, 1920, virtually civil rights were suspended after a series of bombings. Vietnam, we had Phoenix and so forth. What do you think delineates any differences today between the historical record of when there have been even grosser violations of the Constitution? Could you expand on that, please?
Well, we have been here many times before, I agree. And I'm not a historian, but I certainly like American history and have read it. And one of the questions that's open now is this going to be another blot that we then fix and amend? Are we going to find our faith with the values that the country was founded on and the ideals that the country was founded on of the Enlightenment, or have we shifted in some fundamental way that's going to just stay like this?
But in these other cases, Jane, was there as much of a focus of the institutionalization? Because this is a book about the institutionalization, the legal framework, the routinization.
I mean, I was talking with Tom Ricks about it, who knows a lot about the military, and he was saying that for him, it was that he was saying people know things changed after 9/11, but they don't know the most important change is America became a torture state, and that's never happened in its history before. The idea of the United States sanctioning the use of pain, cruelty, torment on people in our who were holding, for questioning, we've not been there before. But there've been other breaches, face it. I mean, there've been all kinds of breaches. But the suspension of habeas corpus during the Civil War didn't last that long. This has now been 7 years. So,
I mean, Colonel Wilkerson, I don't want to put him on the spot, is sitting next to Harlan Ullman, and I don't know if it's in the book or not. But
he's definitely in the book.
He's I saw his photo in there, but I know that Larry has said publicly that once Colin Powell first heard of Abu Ghraib, he came immediately into Wilkerson's office and said, dig up, track, find every memo, anything we may have known about with regards to this, because this is not anomalous. This would have to be a sort of...
it was a program.
Yeah, it was a program.
Right.
And I think that's what's interesting, and I'll talk to Harlan offline, but I think one of the interesting questions is, were there programs that were as routinized as this one? This woman right here in the middle.
Hi, I'm Dana Lessman, and my question was following up on the Pinochet issue. We've talked about domestic criminal liability. Was there any thought, the old joke is that Henry Kissinger thinks about where he's going to travel and where he's not going to travel. So I'm wondering if there was any thought in people you were interviewing about international criminal liability, international criminal court, universal jurisdiction.
Yeah, where's John You've been traveling lately?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Well,
I know
John
he
Hughes
was in Italy because I emailed with him over
right.
there.
John
So,
Hughes got issues with tenure. I mean, people have been trying to get his tenure revoked. But I mean, were people thinking, okay, I'm not going to travel here, I'm not going to travel there?
I mean, they're not likely to be confiding in me at this point, but they look at what's happening in Italy right now. There are a number, practically 24 CIA agents, I think, who've been named, who are being tried in absentia for a rendition, an abduction of a Muslim cleric named Abu Omar over there. The world is a less safe place for people who do these things. I think that much we can say. And part of the thing that was interesting as a reporter is that with globalization and the web and everything else, you can't really get away with things very easily. The story
Maybe
of
instead of a terror watch list, we should have a torture watch list,
Well,
or
there
a
was-
no-fly list, or...
There is a watch that's a worldwide watch for the tail numbers of the planes that do the renditions.
Right.
And that plane could not hide anywhere because you have to be open about what the plane's tail number is. And there were people in airports all around the world with binoculars watching it. So it got harder and harder for the CIA to be in the shadows that Cheney talked about.
Ed?
Yeah, I'm Ed Spanos from Executive Intelligence Review. Apropos of Steve, of your earlier question about Addington, I mean, I first heard of David Addington 2 months after 9/11 from military lawyers who were furious about the military order setting up the commissions, and that they had been bypassed and frozen out of that process already, which seems to be one of the strongest arguments for a war crimes case, is that Addington and the Vice President's office deliberately froze out and bypassed and operated in secret to ignore anyone that had any expertise and experience and knowledge on these matters, right? They didn't want them involved in that process. Do you get into that process as it went on of how anybody with expertise was kept out of the picture? So
That's true. And
Thanks,
it wasn't just expertise that was being eliminated from the councils of where the decisions were being taken. It was dissent. The argument being made, the rationale was national security. We need a tiny, tiny group of people. Only the smallest group can know about these things. But if you read Jack Goldsmith's book, he says he came to believe over time that national security was an excuse for being able to keep these decisions in such a small group of people that dissenters wouldn't be familiar with it. They wouldn't know what's going on. And so
I want to give Jane an opportunity to sign some books and talk to some folks, but
Thank you.
just in final, before we close, a few years ago, and Jane was there, New American Foundation hosted a salon dinner with John Bellinger, and this was a product of some of us getting our first insights into how awful and how deep. I mean, you think back now what we know today, but a few years ago, people like myself were just beginning to sort of hear some of the internal feuds and decisions, the sort of the hero crowd and the sort of I would call them the villains. But you have this excerpt on something called the Big Bang. And I'd like to hear more. I think it's very important, and almost no one has covered this. But you write a small group of reform-minded lawyers inside the Bush administration. It's shocking that there were reform-minded lawyers in the Bush administration. Nonetheless, there were. decided that if the festering issues of Guantanamo and the CIA's black prisons were ever to be seriously addressed, it would take the bureaucratic equivalent of dynamite. The reformers worked in secrecy on a laptop, i.e. their paranoia, where they wouldn't be detected by their superiors. They called it the Big Bang. It was a proposal to shut down the secret detention and interrogation system. And the four involved at that time were the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Gordon England, Philip Zelikow, the counselor to Condi Rice, John Bellinger, who was I don't know if he was attorney then at State.
He was at State
and then
Department.
Matthew Waxman, who was Deputy Director of Policy Planning at State. May have been
DOD.
Actually,
No,
he was
he
at
was at
DOT.
DOD at
He was
that
the
point.
detainee
Yeah.
guy at DOD, and then later moved to State when he himself saw his personal situation endangered. Can you share a little bit, not just here, because I don't think enough people hear that there were folks inside the administration, but the level of paranoia that they had about trying to do the right thing, I think makes this an even greater indictment of the bad guys in the Bush
There was
administration.
incredible intimidation. I interviewed people who said, you have no idea what it was like in these meetings. If you were not as macho as Addington, you were ridiculed and as a wuss. I mean, people were just made to feel like worms, as you mentioned earlier. So these guys were meeting in secret on a weekend, hoping not to be detected, trying, in fact, to write up a plan to close Guantanamo and shut down the black sites that would go behind Vice President Cheney's back. That's basically what they were doing. They were trying to get it directly to Rumsfeld on one side and directly to Rice at the State Department on the other, because they knew if Cheney's people and Cheney knew about it, they'd kill it. And they actually wrote up a very eloquent plan and a potential speech for Bush to give, and Rice liked it, but Cheney hated it, and made sure that it was never even discussed in a meeting after that. And the quote from one of them was, it died on the vine. So
I'll be writing more about some of this Big Bang substance later, but it gets to part of what Gary Mitchell was saying about whether Geneva was enough, or whether, given the certain conduct of war today, whether or not that law needs to be modified and changed. This is a great debate, and I know that people like Bellinger think it's a legitimate debate to have, and it's something that should be held in the open as opposed to in these sort of closed-off circles. But I want to thank Jane Mayer. This is an amazing book.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want to thank C-SPAN for joining us. Thank everybody online. And we're going to bring Jane Mayer right out into the front right now. We've got books available, and she'll spend a few minutes saying hello to some folks and talking to them. Thank you very much.